This
from last
conference will now be recorded.
year. And the second item that I plan to go over today is the recent revision made to their business continuity management examination procedure. But I thought it would be fun to kind of go through a real life disaster. I recently went on an audit in Northern California, and there was a lot of lessons learned that they had, or different things that they have experienced, which closely tied into the revision that was made to the examination procedure. So I thought it would be fun to kind of tie those things in together. And the very last topic that I'll go over is some of the more frequent IT audit findings that we have provided to our clients, as well, I mentioned earlier, some of the more recent regulatory finding as well. The pandemic has been definitely affecting us as well, even though we are mostly remote workers, as well as some on-site audit that we do. But I've learned a lot from the experience. More particularly, I just want to bring it up before I start the actual content of the presentation. At first, we were advising our clients to really have a response plan based on some sort of agency as far as disclosing the level of pandemics. For years, we advised using the World Health Organization pandemic index or cycle. But when it actually come to implementation, we found out it didn't really work because it was too global. What we have learned is that we do have various auditors across the country, and what we have learned, what's more important, is actually following up and monitoring public health website where our clients are located, but also where our auditor is located. So the responsibility was more spread out than I originally thought when we were advising clients to follow World Health Organization pandemic index. In fact, right before the pandemic really started to get rolling, we actually changed our monitoring procedure by using something that was more local, such as the CDC. They call it the CDC pandemic interval, and that kind of helped us adjust our response plan. And so that's something that we learned through that process, and I hope to kind of collect all of these lessons learned from our clients as well as from our own company, and perhaps one day I'll get to share this information with you as well. But back to the main topic. So recently, the FDIC released a FIL known as 17/2020, where they talked about how to work with customers that are affected by the coronavirus. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm only going to go over topics that are kind of relevant to information technology and information security, but there's a lot of items on there on how to communicate with your customers, and also the managing the capital and such. One of the things that they point out in this particular field is that they mentioned that they're going to reduce their examination scheduling burdens. More particularly, they're going to try to do some of the examination off-site, which will be really interesting because I think, as a lot of people experience, when examiners come on site, they stay here for weeks at a time. There's 20 or 30 of them that never fits in the conference room. So it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out. And the second item that's kind of important with this fill is that they actually have a dedicated website on COVID-19. There are materials on there. They're for bankers, but also for consumers. And I kind of went through some of these. Actually, I went through all the documents as of 2 days ago. So I'll quickly discuss some of the main content. 2 days ago, they published an FAQ for financial institutions that are currently being affected by COVID-19. And specifically in this FAQ, they mentioned alternative service options, basically to remind the customer that they can access banking services without physically coming into the branch. They mentioned specifically online and mobile banking, using ATM, and telephone banking. They also discussed providing information on how to use electronic payments, such as bill pay and mobile remote deposit capture services. I apologize, that's my cat. She's participating in this presentation as well. My apologies. They also discuss security. How should a bank handle customer wearing masks when they come to a branch? Was one of the questions that they posed, and I can definitely relate to that. I was at Walmart yesterday. I was trying to pick up a package that I have ordered, and I observed a person there. So this person had a mask, sunglasses on inside the stores, and a hat. And it took me a second to think, well, is this person going to rob Walmart? Because it's very likely that this might actually happen, just given the panic that's happening. But I kind of observed this person for a few minutes, and I realized, well, I think they're just shopping. I can't explain the sunglasses, but or the hat. But that it was an interesting experience for me, and it kind of relates to what the FDIC has documented in this fill, is that they just kind of recommend the financial institutions to continually provide appropriate training to staff, and also take appropriate measure to ensure the safety of both the staff and also the customer. And they remind the banks to contact local enforcement whenever they're concerned about a particular individual that are in the bank's premise. One of the hot topics that they mentioned that I see not only in this fill but also in the actual revision of the business continuity management booklet is the idea of cash management, and not so much on online banking services provided to commercial customers, but specifically managing actual cash. So in this example that I saw in this fill, they want the financial institution to consider reminding their customer about the safety of their money. For a lot of institutions that we're FDIC insured, and kind of discuss the insurance coverage that associated with that. But more importantly, to really closely monitor any deposit, withdrawal, and availability of cash to meet customers' cash needs. And this is a little bit dated since this was published about 2 weeks ago. They kind of reissue an attachment that they created several years ago on pandemic planning. So with that, they kind of highlighted some few points along with the attachment that they have sent out. So the first item is they want an institution to kind of promote employee awareness, communicating the risk of a pandemic outbreak, and of course discussing steps to reduce the likelihood of getting contracted with an illness, and also identifying and prioritizing essential functions, employee, and also resources within the bank and also across other business units as well for the purpose of business continuity. And also testing the roles and responsibility with management, employees, key suppliers, and also customers too, using pandemic planning, using key pandemic planning assumption. But let's go over what has changed in the business continuity management booklet. So this was published back in November, and it is very timely because I believe that's the patient 0 actually got their infection around this time. They mentioned a pandemic testing program, which is basically stress testing, online banking, telephone banking, ATM, and also call center capacities to handle increased customer volume. When I was conducting this audit with a bank up in NorCal, they're a fairly large community bank up there, and they do outsource their online banking function. So one of the discussion that we have, well, how do you stress test that? Because that's outsourced. They have other customers that they need to service. So one of the ideas that came up was really talking to the service provider to determine what they have done in terms of stress testing their platform. This particular revision on the booklet also discussed telecommuting to kind of simulate and also test the remote access capabilities of the bank. My wife worked for one of the bigger company down here in Orange County, and this actually came up very timely because yesterday she was complaining to me that their VPN connection has gone down. And from what she was describing to me, they had to send some of these remote users to other VPN connection or pipe and devices. So it's really interesting and it's very timely that the regulator has put that in their pandemic section. They also discuss having internal and external communication process and links, which I'll discuss a little bit more. And this is a little bit irrelevant now just based on what's happening today. They mentioned that to participate in local, regional, and national testing and exercise, but nothing is better than doing something live, such as what we're experiencing now. But in general, I mentioned earlier cash management, and this is a theme that I think it doesn't get mentioned a lot in a lot of the BCP plan. And here's some example on what they mean. That during a pandemic or any disaster, make sure there's a pre-established cash delivery arrangement. Having plans for increased branch traffic when ATMs are unavailable. ATMs are just machines. They rely on connectivity, and they are subject to going offline. And having plans for the entire entity's operational cash needs, not only at the branches, but also treasury as well. Establishing temporary purchase authority guidelines and what that would look like, and also expense reimbursement options for personnel as well. And this is something that a lot of institutions have not really thought of. For example, if you're sending people to a recovery site and there's a natural disaster, chances are they're not going to be able to commute from the recovery site to their homes, especially during after an earthquake. So it's really important to kind of discuss what is the reimbursement options, but we'll discuss that a little bit more. And also establishing higher limits if employee credit cards are being used, or maybe a separate checking account with designated individual who can sign checks, especially in these emergency situations. And let's discuss some of the other items that are beyond pandemic. This is a very infamous picture now. This is a result of the Camp Fire that happened in 2018, which burned through Butte County in Northern California. To date, it was the deadliest and most destructive fire in California history. When they were doing the root cause investigation, what they found is that the root cause was the PG&E transmission lines. PG&E is basically the monopoly in Northern California when it comes to providing electricity. So what they did this year was something called a public safety power shutoff. What that means is that if they detected high wind in certain area, they will just basically shut off the power to prevent fire. But let's try to apply this particular controlled or man-made disaster to the changes that the FFIEC has made in their business continuity management booklet. One of the things that they discuss is to have the board approve the BCP, business impact analysis, and also the BCP risk assessment. I think a lot of clients that I work with prior to this, they only have the board approve the BCP, but now they also want the risk assessment to be approved as well. And as far as content, they're expecting about half a dozen items, which I'll go over. Of course, the most important part is the BCP team and responsibility. For example, listing the coordinators, critical business process level employees for all the critical operation, people who manage facilities, people who manage payroll, media relation, because that's going to be really important to reassure the customers and the media on the safety of their accounts. Of course, finance and accounting folks are very important as far as managing liquidity and borrowing from the FRB. Of course, there's legal and compliance people as well. And last, of course, IT. So these are the minimum people that you would expect to see on the BCP team. And what we learned from the PG&E disaster with this one particular institution is that it's kind of important to go through this list to determine if the people are essential on implementing the plan. So after this particular disaster, this bank actually had a meeting to kind of go over everything. What have they learned? from this actual disaster, and how can they improve the process. When I was reviewing the attendees in this meeting, there were quite a number of bank executives that were listed in the plan, but they weren't invited to the meeting. So I spoke with the coordinator, and it turns out that these people didn't have a role in terms of recovering from the disaster. So their BCP team is actually out of date. And part of our recommendation is, of course, updating that. They also discuss disaster recovery testing. Of course, testing is really important to make sure you're ready for a particular disaster. And one of the things that they talk about is establishing not only the scope, but also the frequency of testing. If you're a smaller institution, of course, you can probably test all your critical process annually. But for bigger institutions, it's not really feasible. So they recommend breaking up the scope to maybe having testing one critical function periodically, maybe every 3 years. So that was a number that they have mentioned. They also want to make sure that the bank has a designated personnel to kind of review this testing to confirm that the objectives or milestone have been met. And this would normally be the coordinator. They also list a bunch of expectation that they have over the documentation, and we'll discuss that with some of the examination finding that they have on what are some of the key items that they expect to see in these test results, but also having a process to correct deficiency that they identify during the testing. So in the case that we have studied, what the bank did was, prior to the power shutoff, they actually have various BCP team individually perform tabletop testing. And this is really a luxury that they have, because they knew approximately when the power was going to get shut off, so they knew how much time they have to really kind of test and go over everything. Some of the teams, they did identify issues, but unfortunately they weren't followed up on by the designated person, which caused a little bit of hiccup during the actual implementation. As part of the revision, they also mentioned having an event management procedure. So a procedure on reporting events to management, and what type of situation would warrant that notification. What is the event response procedures, and ultimately, who can actually declare a disaster and then act on the BCP plan. And they also discuss having procedure to kind of coordinate with both first responder, local government agencies, and state agency when it's appropriate. And a lot of institutions already have sort of a short and long-term continuity plan, but they discuss specifically having an objective in the actual overall enterprise plan. So for example, what is the solution to foreseeable disruption? What are the immediate steps to protect personnel and customers, as well as minimize the damage? And a lot of the tests that I'm sure you have all taken in the industry, especially for industry certification, and I always get this wrong when I first started in auditing, was what's the first thing that you protect? And the answer is, of course, personnel. Human lives are the most important things when it comes to business continuity planning, or even IT and cybersecurity. So that was something that was just continuously enforced during all the testing that I have taken in relation to IT and cybersecurity. And also critical information protection. So these include physical and electronic documents, or maybe a hybrid of both. And also the use of offsite storage. How are those being protected? We discussed earlier about logistical arrangement, particularly with housing, transportation, and food, especially if you're sending these personnel to recovery location. So in the PG&E real-life case study that I had with this bank, luckily they weren't hit with any natural disaster at the same time as the power shut off. For example, actual fire, forest fire. So this kind of allows the personnel to travel back and forth from their homes and recovery, and the recovery site. But they also had some of the personnel work remotely, because there weren't enough branches on alternate location that were not affected by the power shutoff. And so some of these folks worked at home, but of course they didn't have power, so the laptop eventually ran out. It had a very limited battery capacity. If they did somehow manage to charge a laptop ahead of time, what they didn't anticipate was the cell towers also had batteries. And when the batteries are out, the cell towers are shut off. So that was something that they didn't foresee. And as a result, they didn't really properly plan out the recovery location. So there were a lot of places where they simply didn't have enough space and people needed a place to work. And I even heard one of the stories from one of the employees I interviewed. They actually traveled to 2 or 3 other sites before he actually found a desk that he can work at. And the very last thing as far as continuity objective is the resumption to a normalized state after this disaster is over. The regulator also discussed having a departmental disaster recovery plan. So this plan would discuss who the primary and backup personnel are, and also the supporting activities. For example, what type of technology support do they need, and payroll, which is really important, any contracting arrangement, as well as interdepartmental needs. And one of the cases that we learned from this Northern California bank is that while they did the tabletop testing, it was done on an individual department level. So there was a lot of coordination that they needed to do in order with other departments because they have that interdependent departmental needs. And part of the lessons learned that they had was, well, they didn't know what the other department's DR plan, what a disaster recovery plan was. So it's really important to really think about this during the planning phase, but also performing annual tabletop exercise, not only individually within each department, but with other departments that they have an interdependency needs with. And we also saw another case with this particular disaster that some of the secondary branches actually didn't know they were responsible for branches that have had their power shut off. So they were getting a flood of calls from customers that are usually bank with these other branches, and they really didn't know why. So that's what part of the identifying these interdepartmental needs, but also which branches are the primary site and what's their secondary site, and be able to communicate that across a global level. But in these disaster recovery plan, also identifying hardware needs as far as computers and phones, but also supporting software. For example, emails, maybe specific application that they need. And again, cash reserves. So at a departmental level, one of the lessons that they learned from this particular PG&E incident was that they didn't really plan out how much cash to stock at the ATM, particularly with branches that have been closed. So they were literally doing this on the fly after PG&E has shut off their power. They also didn't really think about, well, how do we retrieve the night drops? So night drop is a secure safe that customer can deposit cash or deposit into this particular night drop for the branch to process. Well, they didn't really plan for that. So they had people that was picking up night drop at night when there's no power, so everything is dark. And this is really important to kind of plan these things out on cash reserve and night drop, because this is from a physical security standpoint to make sure these personnel are safe when they were performing these pickup duties. In the revision to the booklet, they also discuss kind of like an enhanced business impact analysis methodologies, which is a little surprise to me because some of the contents remain the same, but they did make some slight changes on what is actually important when it comes to business impact analysis. So of course, you always start with the departmental functions and what their interdependencies are. So we talked about this earlier. They might have dependency with other departments, telecommunication or service needs, or application or vendor. And in the business impact analysis, they expect to see recovery time objective, recovery point objective, which is really important because it kind of helps you plan your backup, and as well as the hardware that you need to recover, and also maximum tolerable downtime, operational, and financial impact as well. And in addition to a business impact analysis, there are also the BCP risk assessment, the business continuity planning risk assessment. So they discuss the categories of disaster that institutions should really think about, such as natural disaster. So this includes flood, earthquake, hurricane, tornadoes, and pretty much any other weather-related events. They also discuss technological risks such as malware, cyber attack, hardware and software failure, but also operational, such as critical infrastructure disruption. So this is transportation disruption or even with water system. They also recommend the institution to discuss risk related to adversarial or human cause. For example, personnel, employee strike, pandemic, malicious insider, but also the social aspect, such as terrorism, vandalism, looting, riot, and protest, or a combination of different things. For example, events that could affect a particular facility, fire, power outage, loss of access to that facility, and also geographically related type of risk. For example, if the physical location has a close proximity to railroads or highways that are used to transport hazardous material, maybe you're really close to an airport, or there's a lot of traffic congestion that happens around that particular facility. So these are other issues to really think about. And also third party, where services are concentrated to a limited number of third-party service provider, that certainly is one of the risks when it comes to business continuity planning. They also discuss specifically training. And for the first time, and I might have missed this in previous edition of the business continuity management booklet, but they actually list out items and topics that institution can really discuss. For example, what are the upcoming disaster recovery testing exercise? Are there current and future risks that management needs to be aware of? What are some of the recent failures or lessons learned from these disaster recovery exercise or actual disaster? Are there any new programs or technologies that departmental managers need to really think about? Perhaps there's major organizational changes, any significant business continuity planning concept, and again, the whole interdependency that each department have with each other. Maybe discuss disruption impact and also operation resiliency. So when I was working with this particular bank that had their PG&E real life disaster, is that what their plans are, instead of having everyone attend a general training where they kind of go over all these topics at once, and where you end up losing some of the attention of some of the attendees, his thought was, well, perhaps we can go over each of these topics in meetings where all the BCP team members attend, at least the primary BCP team members. So his thought was, well, I can do it during the IT steering committee. I believe they meet monthly meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So this particular guidance also mentioned about BCP and disaster recovery plan distribution, basically making sure that all the business continuity documentation is not stored in one place where it becomes inaccessible in a disaster. For example, in the past, we've seen some of our clients, they would print the hundreds of pages in their manual, including all the departmental plan, and put it in their trunk. But more recently, there has been distribution of USB sticks, perhaps a storage facility that's online where they can access easily on their mobile devices. I've seen one institution, they actually post it on their website, but of course, the plan is encrypted, password protected, but they actually have a link in the footer. So in an event that there's a disaster, employees can just jump online and click on the plan from the publicly accessible informational website. Mm-hmm. They also discuss about communication plan with internal and external parties. So having a diverse method and devices, for example, the use of calling tree, which is just basically a listing of contacts of all the departmental leaders, but also employees, or having a toll-free telephone number with a voice recording where you can kind of disclose information or what the bank's plans are in this general number. And of course, we mentioned earlier about using technologies, instant messaging, perhaps even posting something on the general website, and really having a notification procedures for internal and external contacts. So the external contacts, the regulator mentioned specifically, of course, the regulatory agencies themselves, emergency responder, law enforcement, and also the trade association, as well as any information sharing entities. In banking, FSICEC is our information sharing entities that a lot of institutions use. So now let's move towards the next particular item that had came out last year or in the last 1 year period. And this is pretty recent, back in January, and it's about the heightened cybersecurity risk. In this particular document, they really mention a lot about network segmentation, basically logically segmenting and maybe even in some instances physically air gap certain networks. And these are particularly important with critical network components and services, for example, core processing or any servers that handle transaction data, and even account data should be stored separately on different network, as well as backup, or any other highly sensitive elements of the network environment. These should be really properly segmented with their own network. But more importantly, with network segmentation, you really have to establish access control between each of these segmented network, and this really helps reduce the risk of any malicious activity that will spread across the network. We've seen a lot more network-based vulnerabilities now, and this is really important. Network segmentation can really help reduce the risk. So at my house, I actually segmented my guest network, my Internet of Things devices, and my PC. They're each on their segmented network, and I control the traffic that's going across in between these networks. The device that I use is a brand called Unify. I don't endorse any particular brand, but Unify has done a really good job. In fact, I think the common joke is that they are kind of like the poor man's Cisco network management devices. And as part of this network segmentation, this is really important when it comes to backups. So they recommend either segmenting the backup away from the into a different network with access control, or better yet, having an offline backup such as tape media. I know have moved away from tape media. Many of my clients have, but it's something that might be coming back. And this really helped reduce the risk in case, again, the network-wide ransomware or any destructive malware. And also ensuring that you're securely storing system and data backup off-site at a separate geographic location. For example, we are a West Coast company, so a lot of our backup data is actually stored in the East Coast. And a lot of places are using cloud backup, but it's really important to perform the due diligence to ensure that the backup data is protected from destruction and corruption. In this particular guidance, they also talked about the response, resiliency, and recovery capabilities. So for example, integrating different elements necessary to recover from a cyber event into the BCP. And there's a lot of push for that that I've seen with the regulators. And also ahead of time, identifying cybersecurity forensic and recovery experts that you can engage and assist in if there's an event. And last, conducting periodic cyber recovery exercise or testing your incident response plan to ensure that it is up to date and that everyone understands the actual process. Another topic that they discuss is network configuration and system hardening. And specifically, they mention about default user accounts. So review them. If you can't, disable them or adjust the default username and password before using the actual system. And they have a lot more guidance on what the hardening process is. If you guys need an example or a general 6-pointers guideline, I would certainly can share that with you as well. But as part of the network configuration and system hardening, they mentioned specifically on vulnerability scan. So the coverage should include network components and hardware components, which is basically your laptop, desktop, if you can, mobile devices, and of course, routers and firewall. And having a vulnerability scan that can also detect out-of-date firmware or vulnerable firmware. But the most important part is actually the operating system themselves, making sure that the vulnerability scan actually confirm whether critical patches have been installed, or more specifically, using a credential administrative scans. So in our pen test, as part of the internal vulnerability assessment, we actually asked our clients to input administrative credential. We don't use it for the pen test, but we use it to help them perform a vulnerability scan so that they're aware of any critical patches or misconfiguration that are missing. And especially if the bank has their in-house process, it's really important to have a credential administrative scan done, because that's where the entry point is going to be. In a lot of the cyber attacks I have seen, is that the user are clicking on the phishing email and their system is not patched, and that's how the hacker are able to compromise the network. And specifically, they mention a lot about email system. Configure the email system in a way to kind of prevent the common email attack vectors. For example, spoof or phishing emails that contain malicious links and attachment. And this is something that we actually test with our clients with our pen test products. So at AuditOne, we use a product called Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection, and the result of it is we've been using it for a few years now. I think we're one of the first people that signed up as soon as it was available publicly. And it helped a lot in terms of reducing the number of malware infection from emails. And again, continuing with network configuration and system hardening, they mention about the consistency in managing the risk, especially monitoring internal networks that connect to the service providers. I've seen different implementation where the service provider routers are actually inside the LAN. That's definitely not recommended because there's really no way to monitor that traffic. So you always want to put that in a DMZ zone. And then, so that will give you the capability to kind of monitor that traffic through your firewall. And this is really important for those, particularly those service providers that provide critical services. And they also mention about employee training, making sure they can recognize cyber threats, phishing, and suspicious links, and also doing periodic testing to ensure that the cybersecurity training is actually effective. They also discuss about using various security tools and monitoring. So reviewing your audit logs for anomalous activities or anomalies. It can be done manually, not recommended, or through the use of security information and event management tools such as SIEM. So it kind of help automate the process so that IT can focus on alerts and also doing investigation with these alerts. And these reviews should really be done regularly by qualified personnel. Mm-hmm. They also talked about penetration testing, implementing a sufficiently scoped penetration testing program, which includes testing the bank's ability to detect and respond to attack. I recently worked with a healthcare company where I performed the penetration testing for them in addition to the vulnerability assessment. And afterwards, the IT guy came up to me and said, I didn't even see, the type of attack that you were launching against our system. Like what did you do? Because I want to understand why we're not detecting any of it. So it's really important to kind of make sure that your penetration testing is really testing the detective control that you might have, and of course tracking and correcting any findings from such testing. But let's go over some of the items you're concerned about, which is, well, what exactly are examiners citing banks on? With examination data is kind of interesting. So we do our audit every year. for our clients. But the examination data we looked at usually is a few months old, or maybe from the previous year, depending on the examination cycle. So the data that we're looking at is actually from exam starting in 2018 and all the way to 2019. Interestingly enough, perhaps this is why they revised their business continuity management booklet, is that the top number of findings is related to business continuity planning and disaster recovery. So the sample size that I took is 20, and I'll go ahead and kind of go over some of the key topics in the business continuity planning and disaster recovery area, but also technology infrastructure and security. So there were 5 findings related to business impact analysis. So we talked about that earlier. 2 of the findings were related to no interdependency, were actually listed in the business impact analysis, and we discussed that in greater detail previously. 3 of the findings cited they were either missing recovery time objective and or recovery point objective. There were 4 findings related to BCP risk assessment. Basically, it just wasn't considering enough threats or other disaster scenario, which I have shared with you previously. And also one mentioned specifically on ransomware. There were 4 findings related to disaster recovery testing specifically. Basically, there were no lessons learned or test result documented was one of the case, or in general, they weren't doing any BCP testing. And they cite, and these regulators also cited pandemic testing should be done on a regular basis. There were 2 findings related very specifically to the actual plan. So lack of comprehensive BCP plan, but also the disaster recovery testing. And this is kind of out of the ballpark. They mentioned specifically that the recovery location had no addresses or direction in the actual plan. But I'm pretty sure the employees would know where to go. But that was something that got cited. There was no ransomware response plan was another one. And they had 1 finding each in for the following area. They mentioned that the business impact analysis and the plan was not updated annually. One bank got cited for not having BCP training on an annual basis. One got cited for not having departmental disaster recovery plan. And the last one is not having encryption on server backup. But let's go over the technology infrastructure and security area with the examination finding. So they only have 1 finding each in the area below. One got cited for patch management issue, the other one for not having a hardening policy. The third one had to do with end-of-life asset not being managed properly. So I assume that they had a lot of end-of-life hardware or possibly software and that are still being used in production. And they mentioned specifically data loss prevention, particularly over email and storage media. The very last section that I'll go over is the 2019 audit findings. So these are our audit findings with our clients that we service. Again, very similar theme. The highest area in terms of number of finding is business continuity plan and disaster recovery. And second to that is technology infrastructure and security. In this case, our sample size is 29. And there were 10 findings related specifically to disaster recovery testing. So it ranges very similar to the examiner, not performing testing, not following test script, or the documentation was just really light. And out of these 10 findings, 5 of which we mentioned specifically on pandemic testing. So we definitely try to do our parts in terms of alerting our customer of potential risk. Whether they want to follow them or not is a separate story. There were 3 findings we had where the bank did not conduct any BCP training. 2 of the findings, very similar to the regulator, backup are not being encrypted. There were 2 findings related to the business continuity plan and business impact analysis not being approved by the board. We have 1 finding each in the following area. We've cited a bank for not having a departmental disaster recovery plan. The pandemic plan lacks a lot of details in terms of response and prevention. We cited 1 bank for not having a viable alternatives recovery site. there was issue with one institution in terms of the methodology they use with their BCP risk assessment and business impact analysis. In one of the worst case, no backup was actually being conducted. In terms of technology, infrastructure, security, and monitoring, we cited a bank for, again, not using an administrative credential to scan for vulnerabilities, which is pretty ineffective. Again, the entry point is actually in the operating system. So it's really important to discover through that vulnerability management what are the patches that are missing, particularly with critical and security patches. We cite also in relation to not having a SIEM system. So this was a really a bigger bank where they didn't have a logging system to log to obtain logs from critical devices, but also analyzing them using some sort of automated process to identify potential anomalies. We had 6 findings over patch management and 2 findings over data loss prevention. Basically, the content filtering categories did not consider blocking sites that could potentially lead to data loss. We found one bank, they weren't monitoring their file sharing site that their employees are using to upload information to auditors and other third parties. There were 2 findings related to anti-malware. We found anti-malware wasn't installed on servers, or they weren't doing any scans if they're still using the traditional anti-malware software. We had 1 finding each. One of them is not having access controls, even though this particular institution has designed multiple virtual LAN to segment critical devices from non-critical devices, but they didn't establish any access control rules across each of these networks. One of the bank got cited for not having firewall rules review, and this really should be done on at least on an annually basis. The regulator said quarterly, but it really depends how many changes do you make on your firewall. One of the customer got cited for the password protected screensaver is not controlled centrally. And last, a deficient network diagram. And network diagram is really important in terms of documenting what are the external traffic coming in, how are you segmenting the different LAN network to protect critical devices. And that's pretty much the end of our presentation. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present these material to share with you guys. This is one of my passion. And if you don't mind, I'll just mention briefly about what our firm does. So we're an outsourced internal audit firm, and we mostly serve community banks and credit unions for the last 17 years. And my group specifically is specialized in IT and cybersecurity. And our staff ranges from various experience and various function that they have previously. So we have former system analysts who are very technical, and we also have CIO that work for us. And each of them hold their industry certification that are recognized by government agency and enterprise. Some of our auditors do provide consulting services in addition to SOC type of audit. So our knowledge is pretty vast in terms of what's out there in terms of IT and cybersecurity. But more importantly, we walk the walk. Some of the folks that are our auditors, technology auditors, they also run our IT infrastructure, and they control and monitor our environment as well. And our small size, we're a small size team as well as company, but it kind of allow us to kind of provide a collaborative approach. So we're here to help our clients, not just here to check boxes, but it also gives us the ability to respond to any question you might have. In fact, after this meeting, if you guys have any question that I can answer, I'm more than happy to help. And our small size also allow us to kind of keep on tap on what the latest regulatory requirement and expectations are. And we always try to base our recommendation on regulatory guidance and never really on our personal opinion. As you saw today, the findings that the examiner has versus what we have, they're very similar. So again, we follow the regulatory guidance as far as our recommendation go. And that's it for my presentation. Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity. And if you guys have any question, John, I think I have the capability and ability to answer.
Sure. Yeah, and people can just shout out. We do have that ability to do it through the chat box, but if you just have a question, go ahead and jump right in.
Barry Weber, I have a question. So the question is there movement in audit or the financial organizations to move toward zero trust and microsegmentation?
In terms of microsegmentation, just really separating out the different networks across the different, even down to the departmental level?
No, actually down to the service level.
Oh, down to the service level. Okay.
Right.
You know, in banking, I think we're advanced in some ways, but we're really behind on others. So the push right now is really just getting down to just properly segmenting your network. In fact, one of the story that I always tell was what happened to the Ukraine. They had a cyber attack where in their banking system and a lot of institutions that they have. And what they did was they compromised both the network and the camera system. So they were able to tell when somebody was at their desk, particularly those who controls the ATM. So we're not really, so a lot of institutions I still go to with community banks, they're not even properly segmenting at the higher macro level. So there hasn't really been a huge push on the micro level because we need to get the macro level right, and then they can start moving on the micro level. So I haven't really seen that in financial institution. And it's not something that the regulatory bodies have mentioned us either.
I can appreciate that, but being behind, but contrary to your belief, it actually might be easier to do microsegmentation than to try to do it at the macro level, at the network level, because it's much easier to implement with less impact than to try to do it at the network level. But regulation is where it is.
Yeah.
The other, if I could just add, Kevin, the other sort of gating factor for community banks is, especially among the smaller ones, they're very reliant on third-party service providers who, some are very, very good and some are just, not that great. They're okay. And so they all come at it with different approaches and different priorities, and the banks themselves don't have the expertise to know what to ask for. So it's as Kevin says, kind of an evolving thing. And one of our, our priorities is to make sure that the bank knows what to ask for, to make sure that it's meeting at least the minimums with their service providers. That's a huge area for banks, is the whole vendor management piece, and making sure that there's adequate oversight and SLAs and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Stan, if you could, I just wanted to throw up, Kevin mentioned some really useful materials, and these are, useful materials not just for bank IT folks, but also for let's see here, let me make sure I put the right thing up here.
I just made you presenter, so you got it, dude.
Got it.
Yep. There you go.
Let's see here. Okay, and let me put so here is, and we can send this out. Can you guys see this okay?
Somewhat. Yeah. I know. When you see it, we'll email it out to you guys, but these are the IT booklets that Kevin was mentioning, and they're just really practical, helpful things really for any business, especially in the areas of like information security, management, governance, and that sort of thing. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is these are the examination handbooks, and for anybody that is in an institution, this is just the actual roadmap of what the examiners are going to come in and look for. They're very open about the process. They tell you what to expect.
And so if you have these things addressed, you'll do fine generally in an examination. So both of these are good resources, and we can get these out to you guys.
Mm-hmm. And we can put these on the Secure the Village website as well. We're recording all of Kevin's talk except the very beginning. I forgot to push the record button, and we're still recording, but we'll get that online also, so that we can continue to build up a database of these things. I'm going to stop the recording now.